Morning, my name is David Biette. I'm director of the Canada Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this morning for this discussion on the Binational Planning Group. It should be a good session. Just so you know, we are being webcast. I don't know who's tuning into it, but for those of you who are, hello. And it will be archived. So if you miss something, you can go into look at it later. There's a pretty full program this morning, and the speakers will introduce themselves as part of their presentation. We do have, if you haven't seen them, the planning group's report is outside, as well as a publication we did about a year ago on renewing NORAD, which is based on this. So with this, I will turn it over to Captain McClune and Captain Bergeron, and we're off.
Okay, well, I'll start by introduce myself. I'm Captain Richard Bergeron. I'm the Canadian co-director of the Binational Planning Group. I've been in position since last summer. My predecessor's currently in Afghanistan in charge of all the troops, Brigadier General Fraser, and he looked after the group with his U.S. counterparts for the first 2 years. I've had a career that's been very Navy-centric. I won't go through all the details, but I commanded HMCS Ottawa, was part of the Abraham Lincoln Battle Group, deployed to the Gulf for a period of 6 months, after which I spent time at the Naval War College, 1 year, graduated from there, and then was part of the Navy Warfare Development Command in Newport, Rhode Island, which is kind of the think tank of the U.S. Navy. And then went as director of the Secretariat at the headquarters for 2 years before taking over as the co-director of the Binational Planning Group in Colorado Springs last summer.
I'm Captain Pamela McClune. I'm the acting U.S. co-director of the Binational Planning Group. I started with the BPG in late 2003 as their legal advisor and became acting U.S. co-director in February of this year. Prior to being with the Binational Planning Group, I was the deputy legal advisor to the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD.
Okay, well, I'll stand for the presentation here. And again, as co-directors of the Binational Planning Group, we welcome the opportunity to be at the Canada Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Institute, and to present the work of a total of 50 Canadian and U.S. military personnel who, over the last 3 years, were focused solely on one thing. We were focused on binational issues of defense, and by reason of the mandate, we went beyond defense as we looked at the task we had to do, which forced us to go beyond defense issues. And the theme of our final report, which you have in front of you, it looks thicker than what it is. 42 pages is actually the report. The rest of the document is background material that supports that. But the theme is a continental approach to defense and security. Next slide, please. So the aim of our presentation is to present the findings that we made and recommendation in total 36. We'll brief about half of them because the recommendations stem from strategic to tactical. We won't get into tactical issues today. But we'd like right up front to highlight 2 key recommendations that we made as a result of the findings that we have. First, that between our 2 countries, there's currently no overarching combined vision that has been articulated or defined. And secondly, as a result of the fact we don't have a vision, there's a recommendation that the Binational Planning Group makes to have a comprehensive defense and security agreement between our 2 governments. And we'll talk further about that during the presentation. Next slide, please. So the outline, quickly, we'll talk about the importance of our relationship, a little bit more about our background as a BPG, because we weren't part of a military command structure, and talk about the changing CANUS environment, and using the analogy of a house, starting with the foundation of coordinating mechanism and agreement. We will talk about our recommendation based on 4 functional pillars of our relationships, namely deliberate planning, information sharing, communication architecture, and training and exercises. And all of these recommendations supporting what we advocate to have a continental defense and security approach. Finally, at the end, we'll talk a little bit about future relationship, putting a reality check to where we are today and where we are heading. Next slide, please. Okay, why are we concerned about that relationship? Twofold. The first one, change of threat. Second one, the interdependence between our two countries. Next slide, please. First, about the threat. Nothing new, I think, in this forum with regards to the fact that we went from a bipolar world, a symmetric threat based on a nuclear threat to an asymmetric threat after 9/11, where essentially in terms of capability, there was a switch there, sorry about that. In terms of intent first, during the Cold War, the intent wasn't necessarily always clearly known what the Soviet Union wanted to do. Now, I think the intent is more clearly understood about what non-state actors would like to do. And ironically, when you look at capability, we knew very well the capability of the Soviet Union, where today we don't know so well what are the means that are available to non-state actors. This terrorism, it could go from a simple bomb in a subway to the use of dirty bombs or something much more sophisticated should they put their hand on it. But that's not completely understood. So there's a different shift here in terms of intent and capability. Next slide.
The second reason we are concerned is the economic interdependence of the two countries. Most in Canada and the U.S. think with an east-west perspective, but our economic relationship, a north-south perspective, is key. Just a few stats. Our trade is approximately $1.8 billion per day, with about 300,000 people crossing the border each year and 40,000 trucks crossing the border each day. Those red squiggly lines on the slide represent the oil and gas pipeline systems. Canada sends 99% of its crude oil and natural gas to the U.S. There is definitely an economic interdependence. Slide, please. Another example of our interdependence is the North American electric grid, which provides power on the east side of Canada and the U.S. When there was the blackout in August 2003, it affected 50 million people, 10 million in Canada, 40 million in the U.S., and the economic loss was estimated at $6 billion. Slide, please. This interdependence is also intertwined, though, with our concerns about threats and security. Here on this trade slide, you can see the dip in trade in 2001 after the terrorist attacks. Some of that 2001 dip is certainly attributed to some stock market issues in the U.S., but I think what is even more significant is look how long it took us to recover. So we have defense and security concerns, but our center of gravity is the economic interdependence between our two countries. So we are concerned because of the threat and our economies. Next slide, please. I'm going to move to talk in just a minute about the Binational Planning Group and how we were formed. Slide, please. In December 2002, the governments of Canada and the U.S. signed the Enhanced Military Cooperation Agreement. That agreement has very broad language affirming the merit of broadening binational defense arrangements, not only to prevent or mitigate threats or attacks, but also to ensure that we will have a cooperative, coordinated response to disasters and major events, whether they be natural or man-made. This agreement also established the Binational Planning Group, a group that at its peak had 50 individuals, 25 from each country's military, coming together to work on these issues, primarily in the areas of planning, surveillance, and civil support. The agreement was originally scheduled to expire in December 2004, but it was extended to May 12, 2006. Slide, please. As Richard mentioned earlier, the Binational Planning Group is not in a military chain of command. The intent was to keep us separate so that we could work independently. We did receive terms of reference from the Chief of Defense Staff of Canada and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. with certain tasks. And as we completed those tasks, our focus was always on finding opportunities for improvement and to make sure that we were talking and listening to all of the stakeholders and identifying the best concepts possible for the protection of the citizens of both countries. Uh-oh. Next slide, please.
Okay, now a few words about our changing Canada-U.S. environment. We've already talked about the external environment, the threat that has changed. Next slide. Well, a lot more has happened since that was caused by that change of threat. Prior to 9/11, what mainly defined our relationship was two part-time organizations, namely Permanent Joint Board on Defense and Military Cooperation Committee, one being chaired by political appointees, the other one chaired by senior generals in both Ottawa and Washington. And the third one was a permanent command, NORAD, that has been there since 1958. That's what defined the relationship prior to 9/11. Then we had the events of 9/11, which two governments took action, starting in the U.S. with the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, and at the military level, the creation of U.S. Northern Command. I'd like to stress here, the U.S. Northern Command is a combatant command. That's very significant in terms of who they are. They're a combatant command to the same extent as the ones they had all the way around the world, but there was none in North America. The only command, military command, was NORAD, and now we have a national-focused U.S. Northern Command. On the Canadian side, there was a creation of the Public Safety Emergency Preparedness Canada, which put together a number of agencies together. And it's not a mirror image of the Department of Homeland Security, but the attempt was generally in the same type of trend. And as of the 1st of February of this year, Canada Command was stood up on the military side as part of the vision of General Hillier to operationalize the armed forces and be more focused on domestic issues. Now, these organizations are not mirror image of each other. The one that stood the test of time, if 9/11 wouldn't have happened, that's the only one you would see there in terms of military command, formally there. So that changes a lot the synergy that goes on as part of the standing up of 4 new organizations where even nationally the rapport between those is still evolving and maturing as we speak. On the U.S. side being more mature than the Canadian side by virtue of the time Canada took to put those together. Bottom line, from a binational point of view, the unitive effort between these organizations is critical to the protection of our citizens both sides of the border. Next slide, please. Okay, our final report here, as I mentioned, we've got 32 recommendations. We'll cover some of them, but they're the result of a lot of work. I don't want anybody here to think it took 3 years to get to that. There's a lot of work in terms of planning scenarios that were developed and from which we were able to deduct the things that we recommend. Next slide. Okay, first, the foundation of our house here, coordinating mechanism. We went from an environment where we had legacy agreement, first stemming from the Ogdensburg Declaration that caused the creation of the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, the formation of NATO, and NORAD. Well, now with the new environment we find ourselves in, with the refocused NORAD after 9/11 and 2 new military commands, we must look at issues here on how best to interact between each other. And those coordinating mechanism can be either binational in nature. They could be bilateral. There's got to be the recognition on both sides, because of this, we're a sovereign nation, of unilateral action, which will never prevent Canada or the U.S. to do what they deem, or what we deem, appropriate to do from a national point of view. As well, as part of these mechanisms, there's issues of human resources, personnel. Do we want exchange officers, liaison officers? Where do they need to be positioned to optimize the manner in which we deal with each other in light of this changing environment? And finally, we need to have systems as part of these coordinating mechanisms where information is exchanged. Where are we at today with regards to systems? Where do we want to go in the future? Those need to be more clearly defined to optimize the relationship and the defense of our people. So far, all the initiatives that have taken place have been, we can say, on an ad hoc basis. Lots of good things have happened, but they've happened by virtue of organizations talking to each other more on a stovepipe type approach. The binational planning group recommends strongly that we go from an ad hoc approach to a systematic approach to formalize the relationship and to look at ways to always keep that machine of cooperating between each other. We need to fine-tune it all the time, and we need to have in place regular review processes that are formalized so we don't end up in a situation where we're not optimally aligned between our two countries. Next slide, please.
I mentioned earlier that the Chief of Defense Staff of Canada and the Chairman in the U.S. gave us terms of reference with certain tasks. The first task was to review the existing defense plans and to develop new plans. When we looked at the existing basic security document, which provides the overarching strategic guidance, and the maritime and land operations plan, we found those plans were out of date and had just sort of been put aside. You can see the dates there in red. Those are the dates of the last update. The one exception to plans not being updated was the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD's Concept of Operations plan. That plan, even prior to September 11th, was updated. And now we attribute some of that to the NORAD mission, but also we think it's significant that within NORAD, Canadians and U.S. were working side by side, particularly in planning and operations. The binational planning group then set out to develop 3 new plans. The first is a basic defense document to supersede the basic security document. This document is overarching strategic guidance, and this is a document now of only a handful of pages. The old one was like 150 pages, and we now have about a half a dozen pages overarching strategic guidance. We anticipate that that document will be out this summer. We also developed a civil assistance plan, which is a military-to-military support to a civil agency. Katrina was a great example where such a plan could be useful. It was not used there because it's not been approved yet, but the concept was certainly used. Where the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the U.S. asked for Department of Defense support, and it was granted, and then Canada offered, and it was accepted, Department of National Defense support to support DOD. I want to emphasize I'm not talking about the military of one nation in support of a civil agency in the other nation. It's military to military. And by the way, that support was outstanding, and we are very grateful as a country for Canada to step up. The third plan that we worked on is the Combined Defense Plan, and we developed a mission analysis and a base plan. And this plan is a true military defense plan for responding to the threats and attacks. So again, we anticipate the first 2, the basic defense document and civil assistance plan, to be completed this summer, and the combined defense plan to be completed at the end of the year. We also recommend that we ensure that there is a formal system through an agreement and coordinating body or some other mechanism to ensure that the planning process is outlined and we know who's responsible and what plans will be updated when, so that we do not get back to a time when our plans are outdated. Slide, please. The second pillar of our house is training and exercises. The Binational Planning Group strongly recommends that we look for ways to have greater CANUS interoperability and use combined and joint exercises to accomplish that. So what are we asking, or what are we recommending? First of all, both militaries have what is called a mission essential task list, a list of tasks that we train to, saying, okay, these are the tasks that you need to learn how to do or to keep current. We recommend that there be a combined task list so that we have combined exercises focused on those tasks, that we have more joint and combined exercises, and that we involve security partners such as Department of Homeland Security and Public Safety Emergency Preparedness Canada. We have to have both defense and security partners. We encourage academic research. We think that that pushes us to think in some new ways, and we think that's very important. And to leverage training, Canadians training in the U.S., vice versa, and then placing those people in the appropriate positions. All of this is interdependent, and so we are recommending that all of this be done not just piecemeal. It is so important that we train and exercise not only for unplanned events, but for planned events. My map here is of British Columbia and the state of Washington. The Vancouver Olympics in 2010 is a great example of when the U.S. and Canada must work together. If you look at the security issues, geography alone will force us to work together, and we need to train and exercise together now so that we can work together for events such as that. Next slide, please. Information sharing is key. When we looked at the information sharing agreements between Canada and the U.S., one of the things that we found it was that the agreements were mostly about protecting information that was shared, not directing information sharing. So, and that comes from sort of this linear approach that we have today in information sharing, and that we kind of talk to our counterparts, but we're not as good at talking to people that are not our direct counterparts. State Department may be talking to Department of Foreign Affairs, but not talking as much to on the defense side. So, and the same with the environments and services. Our navies have a fantastic relationship, but we don't have as good of communication across environments and services. So we recommend that we move to more of an interrelational model where we're talking not just to our counterparts, but among all defense and security partners, services, and environments. So how do we do that? We recommend that there be a nation-to-nation information sharing agreement that not only provides authority to share, but provides direction to share. And this agreement should include not just the military, but security partners, keeping in mind that there are privacy issues, there are national laws, policies, directives with respect to information. We're not advocating that we throw those out, but there's a lot of information sharing that we can do. We also recommend that we look at updating the CANUS threat estimate on a more real-time basis. The military now issues this annually, and we think that this should be almost a virtual document. Also looking at the threat estimate from the security partners at the same time. And then some recommendations to ensure people have the information that they need to do their job. Classification at appropriate levels, making sure that we classify documents only when they need to be classified and not overclassify, and ensuring people have access to networks and the information that they need, particularly people working in a binational environment. Slide, please. And our final pillar is communications architecture. None of our recommendations are really possible without interoperability. We have to be able to talk to each other, and that requires systems. So, near term, we recommend that we leverage the Griffin Network Bridge. That is a bridge that allows a U.S. secret system then to talk to the Canadian Titan system. Without that bridge, although Richard and I are sitting in the same suite, I cannot send him a classified email. Those are the kinds of things that we need to do, and there's still some questions with Griffin, for example, with attachments, but we need to take those interoperability steps. We also recommend that the users, defense and security, get together and really define their needs so that our IT people can and our comms people can really focus on a goal that we all agree to. Network-centric applications are done on a national basis by each country. We recommend that we look at doing those on a binational basis. And long-term, we may even want to look at a government-to-government circuit. But we need to have systems that allow us to talk to each other to make these things happen and to protect our citizens.
Next slide, please. So far, as part of our foundation and the 4 functional pillars in which recommendations are embedded, all of those are there to support what we advocate to be continental defense and security approach. To put context into all this, it's important to look at nationally what is done. On the Canadian side, is there direction? Is there a vision? The National Security Policy in Canada and the International Policy Statement are 2 documents that provide clear directions to various government agencies about what is expected of them. And it's clear, and there is a vision out there for that. Same thing on the U.S. side. The National Security Strategy and the National Strategy for Homeland Defense are 2 documents that clearly define what is expected of U.S. agencies. So U.S. Northern Command knows what their marching orders are. And those are very clear. Actually, there's more common language that can be found when you look at these documents than can strike the eye. However, when you look at the combined vision and we look at how Canada and the U.S. do things together and where do we want to go, that vision is not there. So that's why our recommendation right up front, we need to have that, and we need to have a vision that will be articulated in a very direct way between the 2 countries by the way of a comprehensive defense and security agreement. If we don't have that type of agreement, does that mean that nothing's going to happen? No. There's already a whole range of issues that have happened. But they happen from the bottom up, and they end up being forcing function depending on the various organizations that are responsible for parts of the mission. So we need to make sure that at the end of the day, we will end up, as we evolve over time, with that vision and agreement that will define our relationship for the decades to come. In doing that, defense and security from a binational point of view cannot be taken in isolation. We've talked about recommendation about information sharing that we need to talk more with the various agencies. We're not talking here about integrating defense and security, but we're talking about having a whole lot more coordination between these agencies so they communicate better and we're more effective at closing the seams and gaps that could be exploited by non-state actors. Good news about some of the positive things that have happened. On the Permanent Joint Border Defense, for example, it was noticed that after the Cold War, up until 9/11, there was clearly a lull in activities. And there's no permanent staff assigned to both Permanent Joint Border Defense and the Military Cooperation Committee. So those became secondary duties that, to be honest with you, not a whole lot came out of it for a period after the Cold War. Over the last 3 years, the Binational Planning Group being a full-time body, we've been supporting them as they requested. And a few of the recommendations we've given them, they've already adopted, one by which they are now including as part of the board of the PJBD, representative from Department of Homeland Security and Public Safety Emergency Canada. They both sit on the board. On the Military Cooperation Committee, a recommendation we made is that committee needs to be more focused on strategic issues in light of the reorganization that's taken place in both countries. They used to deal with all sorts of issues on that committee, from strategic to tactical, when there was a deployment of Canadian troops abroad, for example. Now, this is not where these things need to be sorted out. We've got in Canada a commander of expeditionary command, CEFCOM, that looks after that. So they've been refocused. A new terms of reference have been issued by General Hillier and General Pace. They had their first meeting 3 weeks ago. We briefed our final report to them, and their last meeting was under the new terms of reference, where they will be focusing on strategic issues only. At the operational level, it's important that issues of operational nature be dealt with at that level. And the three commanders are looking at how they should relate in the future to deal with those type of issues. A final recommendation by way of the relationship here, and to improve it, we are recommending that a small advisory organization be put together full-time to support these groups and to ensure that the focus doesn't stay stovepipe in defense and, on another hand, security, but that expertise be made available to ensure that defense and security is looked together as it's to support these various groups, PJBD or MCC. Bottom line is, a lot of intergovernmental and interagency issues are part of our new environment, and we need to take the steps to make sure that we empower the people responsible for these organizations to do what they've been asked to do in light of the new environment we find ourselves in. Next slide, please. Speaking about future relationship and these four new organizations, Chapter 7 of our final report, and this morning I won't go into the four concepts that we present, but four concepts are presented with an analysis of political implication, operational implication of each of them. You note that I mentioned concepts and not options. Why didn't we go into what are the options available and what's the best course of action, the best option in a typical military way? If we would have done that, we would have probably satisfied one or two players among the new players, and the other one wouldn't have been happy. The report has been written in a way to be non-prescriptive, but to assist the key stakeholders who are the decision makers. We are not the decision makers. To use our report and to use these four concepts as a baseline in looking at the issues that will define the future. A NORAD renewal is about to be signed soon. We had nothing to do with NORAD renewal at the Binational Planning Group. But in terms of future relationship, we say that that renewal will not be an end state. There'll be other iteration as we evolve in the future, and one may compare the future relationship as we look at the end of the Second World War, which eventually led to, in 1958, as the threat evolved, to the formation of NORAD, to a situation today that we are 5 years after 9/11, and one may argue we will be evolving in light of the formation of these four new organizations, and we need to do that in the most constructive and efficient way. And that's what these concepts are there to bring to the key stakeholders as they look at developing options and taking elements of these concepts and assessing which options are the best for our future. Next slide. In summary, what are the key issues we talk about? First, we have a need to have a unity of effort through a strategic vision that needs to be articulated and needs to be implemented by way of a comprehensive defense and security agreement. Those are two key recommendations. And finally, there's an issue of momentum that as national agencies mature in their evolution, they're all very young organizations that 4 years ago weren't there. We need to look at the future with the spirit of momentum and not stalling because nothing has happened since 9/11, but bring the protocols together that need to be there to ensure that our citizens on both sides of the country are best protected. This concludes our presentation. We're open for any discussion, and as part of the panel, have a dialogue and exchange over our report. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Bergeron. Thank you, Captain McClune. We're going to go into the next part of the program, and I will introduce the folks who are going to comment on it. Colonel John Orr joined the Royal Canadian Navy in September 1963 and is a graduate of the Royal Military College of Canada and the Canadian Armed Forces Staff College. He served overseas as Canadian Forces Attaché in Cairo and as Secretary to the Chief of Staff of Headquarters Allied Forces Central Europe. After completing appointments as Deputy Commander, Maritime Air Group, and the Maritime Air Component Commander Atlantic, Colonel Orr returned to the Middle East as the Chief of Liaison with the multinational forces and observers in the Sinai. Upon completion of that tour, he retired from the Canadian Armed Forces and is currently a research fellow with the Center for Foreign Policy Studies at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And to my immediate right is Joseph T. Jockel, who's a professor of Canadian Studies at the St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. He's currently a visiting professor at the Canadian Forces College in Toronto. He's also a co-editor of the International Journal. He's been a Fulbright Scholar in War Studies at the Royal Military College of Canada, senior resident of Massey College, visiting scholar International Relations Program at the University of Toronto. He's worked for Canadian Affairs at the State Department. He's taught at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He is one of the experts on Canada-U.S. relations, particularly defense relations. Author of numerous books, and I won't go on, but JJ and I have worked together for years, and it's my pleasure to welcome him to the Center and Colonel Orr. So I'll turn it over to you. I guess, John, you want to go first? JJ.
Okay. Thank you. I was also a long time ago a fellow here at the, or there at the center when it was still in the castle. It's a great pleasure to be back and to see the new facilities. I'm just going to comment on two aspects of the BPG's report. First, it's recommendation for a comprehensive defense and security agreement. And second, here dovetails nicely with the briefing you heard. It's this discussion of concepts for command and control, or you may think of this part as NORAD and its alternatives. The two approaches are not exactly reinforcing. That's what makes or not entirely complementary. And that's what makes partially the report interesting, and let me to talk about these two aspects. So first, comprehensive defense and security agreement. This would entail a fairly dramatic break with how our two countries have conducted our defense relationship. That relationship has been based on structures, mechanisms, and agreements that have been fairly informal, pragmatic, limited, functional, and bureaucratic. And the BPG itself, in an interesting appendix, lists literally scores and scores and scores of such informal, pragmatic, or semi-formal, pragmatic, limited, and functional agreements. This preferred approach to how we conduct our bilateral relationships is, of course, symbolized by at least two great agreements in the history of the relationship. The Ogdensburg Agreement, upon, or I even got it wrong, the Ogdensburg Declaration, upon which most of the relationship rests. It was nothing more than a press release which Franklin Roosevelt wrote with his fountain pen on the dining tablecloth in his private car when he and Mackenzie King met just outside of Ogdensburg, New York. The tablecloth was handed off to the press agents and released. That still provides the original basis for the conduct of Canada-U.S. defense relations. And of course, NORAD itself, when it was created in 1957, was also done simply on the basis of the authority of the Secretary of Defense and the Minister of National Defense to authorize command arrangements. It was called into existence by a press release issued in August 1957 by the Minister and the Secretary of Defense. Even the later NORAD agreement is simply an exchange of diplomatic notes, highly limited in its extent. Both countries have preferred such a informal, pragmatic, limited, bureaucratic approach. Canada has preferred it, of course, for fear of being overwhelmed by the greater military power of the United States. The United States has preferred such an approach for fear of being constrained by the smaller power, which is much, much more limited military. Thus, we've tended to take matters on a case-by-case basis. We've seen this old approach reworked after 9/11. Shortly after 9/11, there were plenty of people in both countries, more in Canada than in the U.S., who pushed the big idea. That is, given what happened on 9/12, as Desmond Morton put it, while Americans always must remember 9/11, Canadians must remember 9/12, when the border all but closed down. It's a myth, by the way, that it was entirely closed, but it was functionally closed. After this period, many Canadians suggested that, in fact, we move to a peripheral defense arrangement, that we Schengenize, in essence, North America, and through a harmony, peripheral arrangements, and minimize the border, much as it exists in the Schengen Agreement. In fact, we went precisely in the opposite direction, not towards the periphery, but to maximizing border management as the heart of the post-9/11 Canada-U.S. security arrangement. In the final analysis, Canada did not trust the United States with its identity, and the United States did not trust Canada with its physical security. Hence, we came happily to the functional arrangement of maximizing security through border management, and buttressing it with a new functional arrangement between two new bureaucracies, the Department of Homeland Security and its new partner in Canada, Public Security and Emergency Preparedness Canada. Unfortunately, we have another tradition in Canada-U.S. defense relations that's probably drawn from broader diplomatic practice, and that is empty declarations of intent. If you look back over the history of presidential prime ministerial summits in particular, although you'll see some of this in some of the encounters at the ministerial level, you will see endless declarations of an intent to do something, to harmonize, to agree, to make new use of, to share a vision, to share an approach. I fear that any attempt to negotiate a comprehensive and defense and security agreement between our two countries will not facilitate a substantive change, and in fact, if pursued, will inevitably turn into an empty declaration issued by the President and the Prime Minister at some future summit. The BPG, in this functional tradition, however, later in its report, discusses NORAD and its alternatives. This is timely, inasmuch as the agreement expires on the 12th of May, and you should take it as a striking indication that something is up, that the announcement of the renewal has not yet occurred. NORAD, I won't go into the whole background of NORAD. NORAD was created to coordinate a vast continent-wide air battle in 1957, when the RCAF had no fewer than 9 squadrons of aircraft, fighter aircraft. The United States Air Force had no fewer than 65 squadrons, 3 great detection systems stretched across Canada, and another one across the United States. The Americans were equipped to use nuclear weapons in both the United States and Canadian airspace. President Eisenhower and the Canadian government had delegated to the American Air Defense Authority the right to use nuclear weapons over Canada. NORAD was a battle command designed to draw upon vast resources. It later turned into an extremely sophisticated warning and assessment apparatus of attack, especially as U.S. nuclear strategy grew more sophisticated into in the 70s and 80s as the United States began to pursue strategies based on protracted nuclear war and limited strike. NORAD's assessment role became an absolutely essential part of that. Well, today, where does that leave us? There are no vast continental air defense resources. They're long gone. There would be no vast air defense battle. Air defense is pretty much a local responsibility in the three NORAD regions. A sophisticated, as sophisticated warning and assessment of nuclear attack is not needed. And above all, no systems to detect or track ballistic missiles have ever been located in Canada or directly operated by the Canadian forces. So Canada makes no contribution, and for a reason that I'm sure you're all familiar with, at least as it now stands, will make no contributions to missile defense. So all of those now require reassessment after 9/11, especially as in the terrorist era. And there's been another major change that makes the BPGs taking this up timely. As you heard, both the United States and Canada have created new commands. I suspect several years ago when the BPG was just getting underway, the establishment of Canada Command came as an enormous surprise. The BPGA began its discussions based on a constellation that was pretty much NORAD, NORTHCOM, and an older command system in Canada based around the deputy chief of the defense staff. Suddenly, Canada wound up as well with a command with responsibility not just for the homeland but for the partner in North America. Since Canada Command also is responsible for activities in North America, just as NORTHCOM is responsible for North American responsibilities. Well, where does this leave us? Last year, the Martin government, searching for symbols of Canada-U.S. cooperation at a time that the relationship was deteriorating, first agreed to the adding of maritime warning. We can talk about what that means. It's not maritime operational activities. Maritime warning to NORAD's responsibilities. And also agreed that the NORAD agreement would be renewed in perpetuity, bringing to an end these cycles of usually of 5 years. Strikingly, and this could change between now and May 12th, strikingly, the Harper government is now set to renew NORAD only for 2 years. This is the first time this will have been done since 1973, at a time when the air defense arrangements were changing rapidly. This means we will now have the first real review of what NORAD means ever since it has been created over the next 2-year period. And that's why the concepts that the BPG proposes at the end of its report are especially useful for Americans and Canadians to think about the command and control arrangement we want for our defense arrangement, particularly with respect to aerospace defense and then potentially in other areas. I don't think I should go over this very at length, but let me just mention these 4 concepts briefly and close, and we can talk about them. The BPG talks about, the first concept is 3 commands: NORAD, NORTHCOM, Canada-Com, with complementary missions. In this concept, the NORAD mission would be expanded to include all-domain continental warning in addition to aerospace control. This is pretty much what we're going to be getting temporarily over the next 2 years with maritime assessment being added to NORAD's responsibility. But as the BPG itself points out, the maintenance of 3 equal commands could result in tension amongst these commands. In this concept, there is risk that NORAD could become increasingly marginalized as the prominence of the two national commands continues to grow. Second option or concept the BPG suggests is single command for continental defense, the North American Defense Command. This certainly has a certain amount of attractions with respect to cleanliness, directness, simpleness. It's not in the cards, though, I predict. It is simply too great a step, particularly for Canada. I should add, again, quickly, a single command for continental defense would still mean the existence of NORTHCOM and Canada-Com. It would mean that for certain missions, NORAD could be given responsibility. The final two concepts are especially interesting, and this is where the BPG has contributed enormously to our ability to think about the next 2 years. First is a standing combined joint task force responsible to both NORTHCOM and Canada-Com. That would mean, in essence, replacing the current NORAD command structure with a task force, drawing its existence from an arrangement between the two national homeland defense commands. In terms of the ability to support both commands and to evolve, that could be and to remain flexible in the bureaucratic, flexible tradition of Canada-U.S. relations, that could be might be a very attractive model to decision makers over the next several years. The final model, or I want to stick to their terminology, concept, extends the notion even further. That is a continental joint interagency task force with responsibility to NORTHCOM, Canada-Com, DHS, and PSEPC, Homeland Defense, and the Canadian equivalent. Well, we've never operated such a joint civilian-military task force in North America, but it may be time to think about it, and it's time to think about all these alternative models, because again, it certainly looks like over the next 2 years, subject to change at any moment, we're going to be talking about command and control arrangements for North America. Thank you.
Thank you, JJ. Colonel Orr?
Well, I'd like to say me too to everything that Professor Jockel has said here. And but first of all, I'd like to thank both Captains McClune and Bergeron for an excellent presentation and a summary of what has been, I'm sure, a very challenging and interesting project. And certainly I'm also positive that your final report is going to trigger a lot of debate as we've seen about what the future will hold for this relationship, particularly since the NORAD agreement is up for renewal. I've been asked by David Biet to analyze and critique the report, and I've got to tell you this is a daunting task in a couple of ways. First, I've only had a limited time to look at issues that these folks have been looking at for 3.5 years, so if I make a bonehead error, please excuse me. And secondly, of course, I share the panel with Dr. Jockel and David Biet, two of the 50-pound brains in CAN-U.S. relationships. And certainly, I feel somewhat like the fellow on the TV commercial who does something spectacular, has absolutely no qualification in it. He said, "But I did sleep in a Holiday Inn last night." Wow. I slept in a Best Western, but you get my point. The first question I had about the binational planning group was, why did we have to form one? And it's not indicated in the, or at least I couldn't find a specific reference to it in the final report. But of course, as has been already mentioned by Professor Jockel, this bureaucratic approach to difficulties or problems in the CAN-U.S. defense relationship has in fact been done once before, and Professor Jockel has written a book about it, and it relates to the establishment of NORAD and the formation in 1953 under the auspices of the PJBD of the Military Study Group, which eventually led to the establishment NORAD agreement. My question was specifically related to the PJBD and MCC. We had these structures; they were in place. Why weren't those agencies used? And of course, the answer is, as was mentioned in the presentation, at least, that both PJBD and MCC entered a sort of stasis. They became moribund, and they were not dealing with critical issues. And of course, who could see what was coming down the road? But I think it would be important to include some sort of reference to the fact that the BPG is not an exceptional approach to resolving these issues, that in fact it has been used in the past very successfully. The next point I have is achievement of the aim. And did the BPG achieve the tasks that were set out in the diplomatic notes exchanged from the Secretary of State and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and also the further tasking from the Chief of Defence Staff and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? And this relates to the format of the final report. Now, I looked at the interim report of the Binational Planning Group, and they assessed the tasks that were assigned in a point-by-point manner. It appealed very much to my simple military mind. And it was easy to assess where achievements had been made. It was also easy to see where there were weaknesses or areas that needed attention. Certainly in this regard, the cataloging in the interim report of all the CANUS Defence and Security arrangements is quite incredible. It's a task that I understand has been attempted previously, and people just gave up. So hats off to you folks for persisting and getting it done. But they developed in the interim report a scorecard matrix was developed, and it's easy to assess the status of the tasks and so on. It wasn't repeated in the final report, and I'd ask the question, why? Was it the different commanders' approach to this, or is there some other reason? My next point is that I find the report as very NORAD-centric. This isn't a slam against NORAD and the vital role it's performed over the years and continues to perform to this day. It just seems to me that for a report that aims not to be prescriptive, an awful lot of reference to NORAD has crept in, and Professor Jockel has already spoken about the options that are outlined in Chapter 7, which are really the meat, from my perspective, of the presentation. And they are much less NORAD-centric, but the rest of it has a real tone to it that I find, it's sort of situating the appreciation, if you don't mind. I recognize that the BPG was created in Colorado Springs, although not of the NORAD Northcom thing, but I think there's been an influence there that may in fact bias people's review of the excellent work that's done in Chapter 7. Homeland defense, homeland security, and the threat is my next point. And it's mentioned in the final report that the world has changed. Certainly the attacks in London, Madrid, as well as here in the United States, have indicated that there's a change in the way that things are happening in the world, and the development of an asymmetric threat by non-state actors is, of course, the flavor of the month. But it's important to recognize, and I didn't see much of a discussion about this, that these asymmetric actions are ones that in the past were dealt with by constabulary response. In other words, the security agencies, the constabulary agencies of each nation took care of these things. That clearly is not, to have those folks do that only, or have that solely their mandate, is not acceptable anymore. Hence, the armed forces of both countries have become involved in this aspect. But it's important to recognize that there are two different approaches either side of the border. In Canada, aid to the civil power is a recognized constitutional process. we have a long history of calling out the military to assist civil authorities in putting down strikes, fighting forest fires, and so on and so forth. This is not, I understand, the situation in the United States, and I just wonder if there are going to be problems, I mean the posse comitatus issue, and so on and so forth, if there are going to be problems having militaries assist civil authorities, particularly other countries' militaries assisting civil authorities, and so on. And as I said, it may be there, but I certainly didn't see it. My next point is that, in this regard, is that nationally, and this has already been mentioned, the Departments of Homeland Security and PSEPSI are new. They've got a lot of sorting out to do within their own organizations, and I think that the amount of horsepower that's available to beat people over the head, to come up with solutions to dialogue, and so on and so forth, is that horsepower to focus on a particular issue is going to be willy-nilly nationally focused first before it's binationally focused. So I think there has to be some acknowledgement of that somewhere in the future deliberations. Planning. I read the chapter on CANUS plans with interest, and I just like to say that the good planners are very rare birds indeed, and they have to be put in a back room, fed Doritos and Coke, and told to go off and plan. And it's really important that they keep doing this planning effort. And I just note that in NATO, once the general defense plans were written and established, planning staffs just atrophied because there was nothing for them to do. So in the CAN-U.S. context, a staff of dedicated planners to some binational organization, I think, is simply a bridge too far. I don't think you're going to get it. There's only very few people that can master this skill, and they're going to be gobbled up by national priorities and will be loaned on a case-by-case basis to deal with CAN-U.S. issues. Because once the plans are written, and I recognize that NORAD reviewed their plans routinely, well, basically once the plans are written, there's not much for them to do, and there's a whole bunch of other crises in the world that need to be done, and there's only very few of these people around. Another aspect of planning that needs to be addressed is, and this is perhaps within the context of training and exercises, but the military planners can overwhelm civil agencies with their jargon and the absolute massive number of plans that they can generate. And I'd suggest that a firm objective should be to introduce the civilian agencies, either on a binational basis or within their own national structures, to the intricacies of military planning. I'm not saying that military planning is bad. I'm just saying that from a cultural perspective, a civilian agency stepping into this goes, oh my God, what are these guys doing? And it really is a bit of a black art, and people need to be introduced to it. Intelligence and information sharing, my only point on this is that while there was an extensive discussion in the final report about all this, I didn't see any mention of the coalition-wide area network that was used at sea in the latest iteration of the Gulf War between Canadian warships and the U.S. battle groups. That addresses some of these interoperability, releasability kinds of questions that might be useful in your further deliberations. My final point is about timeliness. And I just note that the Calgary Herald had a editorial about this last week, and they were talking about the final report. And I don't know if you guys have seen this one, but and I'll quote it. It says, "Canadians should be surprised that when a U.S.-Canadian task force established to, quote, enhance binational military planning, surveillance, and support to civil authorities delivered its report last week, its conclusion, 3.5 years after it was set up, is that action should be taken." How many of us thought, nearly 5 years after 9/11, that this was not being studied but had already quietly been done. And my point is exactly that. I think you folks have had to take the time to study this issue, but it's going to need somebody with a cudgel to get on with things, because it's pretty clear that, like the Traveller in Robert Frost's poem, we have miles to go before we sleep. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Colonel Orr. Thank you, Professor Jockel. Before we open the conference to some questions from the floor, I'd like to see if Captains McClune and Bergeron have anything they'd like to respond to, or questions among the panel first.
Just I'd like to respond to a couple of things. It's easy when you present a report like this to not see the work behind the report. We've had the issue that Colonel Orr just raised before. You know, it is not a case that we sat for 3.5 years and then said, we need a vision. And so, but in presenting this report, we decided deliberately not to focus on all that background work. And I think we need to review some of those things, because it is very important. First of all, as mentioned, we developed the CANUS document library. We've found 850 documents relating to the Canadian-U.S. defense relationship. Approximately half of those were agreements of some kind: military to military, government to government, service to service, state to province. Other documents were military directives with respect to civil support, for example, strategies and those kinds of things. And finding those documents, as Colonel Orr mentioned, was an incredible task. Developing the plans to write 3 CANUS plans was certainly huge. We've held an information sharing conference for law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border. We developed 9 scenarios for our planning efforts, held tabletop exercises, other exercises, and then wrote the 3 plans that I mentioned earlier. We placed BPG personnel in the U.S. Northern Command Joint Ops Center to work on information sharing, particularly in the maritime domain. We also placed Canadian officers in the NORAD U.S. Northern Command Combined Intelligence Fusion Center, again to look at information sharing issues, and within NORAD U.S. Northern Command training. So, and that's just a small piece of that. So, and I understand kind of where that perception comes from, but I do want to make clear there was a lot of work done for us to make these recommendations, and they are based on a lot of analysis. And I guess the other point that I want to make personally is in response to Dr. Jockel, in that we understand that what we're saying, the comprehensive defense and security agreement and vision, is hard, and I tend to be a glass half full person, and the fact that it's hard, I think, should not deter us, because I think it's needed. We need to have focus, and we need to move away from this ad hoc relationship and have a systematic where our resources and our focus are all going towards the same goal.
Yeah, and just a few comments here beyond what Pam just said, and that echoed some of the notes I had, but just to reassure people with regards to the work that has been done at the BPG, is as the BPG folds out come the 12th of May, the functions will continue. And they continue by way of having, we've already turned over certain files at the strategic level to those responsible at the Pentagon and at the new strategic joint staff in Ottawa. And we say, this can't stop there. We're into an evolutionary process. We never had the pretension as a binational planning group to say, this is the way things should go, and these things are closed and they're fixed. Life goes on. The reality of the relationship will continue to evolve, and these files, people are aware of them. Have we achieved our task, as Colonel Orr said? I believe we did. Does that mean that everything is done deal, we close the file and it's over? We're into a dynamic, very much dynamic situation. So as we look beyond the BPG, I think you can be reassured that the function will be embedded in the future at the operational level within the commanders of commands, and at the strategic level they're being assumed by those responsible for those. The other point I'd like to just emphasize here about what Pam just said with regards to Dr. Jockel, and he says, well, he's afraid of an empty declaration. If there is an empty declaration, my reaction would be we might as well not have it, because things will continue to evolve. There's a great deal that has happened after 9/11 in terms of border management. Those are all good things. But we want to avoid, and this is one thing we want to stress, and the purpose of having that vision and agreement, if tomorrow morning we wake up, or if in 6 months from now we wake up one morning and there's another significant event, right now there's a bit of a sense of security among the Canadian public on the issues of security. Nothing has happened since 9/11. But when that happens, you don't want to be in a situation that that very event will cause us to be reactive to the extent that, why weren't we prepared? Why didn't we have a vision? Where is it that we want to go? And in defining the vision and the agreement, it ensures that protocols are in place, the culture, the trust is in place to not being reactive when such an event happens, but being prepared from a strategic communication point of view that both countries can address an issue on a common footing, vice being in a position to say, we never really agreed about how we were going to do business together. And it may, in the end, take an event to cause this to crystallize, but I think in terms of timing, there's no doubt it takes leadership, it takes advocacy way beyond the binational planning group, because we're not in politics, we're not decision makers, but we're bringing to the floor issues which, as part of the four concepts, hopefully will be of assistance to those stakeholders as we define the future.
Thank you very much. Questions? We have a microphone since we're being on the web. Please speak into the microphone. And could you identify yourself, please?
My name is Erica Simpson, and I'm a professor of international relations and associate professor of international relations at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, so I'm one of the 300,000 people that crossed the border this week. I had a question about Canada-U.S. preparedness, and this question is our preparedness for detecting a heavily shielded radiological device that crossed the border in a car. And my question is for Richard and Pamela, but perhaps Dr. Jockel and Colonel Orr might want to respond. I talked yesterday to Vale Oxford. He's the director of the Domestic Detection Office of the Department of Homeland Security. I was talking to him about the possibility of a terrorist taking a heavily protected radiological device over the border in a car, and he thought that this is one of the greatest threats, because right now U.S. detection officers do not even have on the small roads advanced radiographical systems that would detect that. And so the problem is that the current technology, even on the U.S. side, is not sensitive enough. The next generation systems will be very sensitive. In fact, they probably will detect everything, including radium in cat litter. And so we're going to have all these false alarms and so on. But they sound like they're getting really ready for this. The Canadians, are we buying this next generation? Are we getting this new radiographical devices? And more importantly, do we have planners in the U.S. detection office that are working with Americans on this, which is even this guy, the director of domestic detection, thinks is one of the greatest threats. So I mean, I think all the vision that you have and the charts and so on are great, but I guess I want to get into the nitty-gritty of what our actual preparation is.
Okay, maybe I can start on the nitty-gritty. The binational planning group, we weren't involved in the nitty-gritty. What we know is there's a lot of research that's taking place to close, technologically speaking, those seams and gaps. If the technology allows that to happen, there's obviously a cost to that. It's got to be figured in budget. I know on the maritime side, I think one of the big key step here is in ports with regards, there's an issue of volumes here. There's an issue of free society moving around. It's huge. We don't want that to stop. It's the needle in the haystack. And may I suggest, while there's technology looking at these things, the work that we've done and the agreements and the spirit of culture change with regards to information sharing, this is where that needle can be found. To prevent this from happening, it may be a piece of information from intelligence that comes globally. You mentioned about the global network. This is not something that we focused on as part of the binational planning group because it was mainly Canada-U.S., but there's no doubt there's a world effort to cooperate among allies, and this needs to be streamlined, and the manner in which we share information allows us to intercept something when we have the right piece of information. And we say, if something happened as a result of not sharing information, well, we're at fault on both sides for not putting in place what needs to be in place to make sure that the right information is shared with the appropriate agencies. And this is not only a defense, it becomes a defense and security issue in significant ways. The maritime domain, for example, you can't look at maritime strictly in a stovepipe. Maritime soon, very quickly becomes land domain the minute a ship arrives in Halifax, Vancouver, Montreal. It ends up on a truck, in a container, on a train, crosses the border. That's why this agreement is important in terms of setting the tone of how we want to share and breaking some paradigms that have been there. I mean, there's great work, Navy to Navy, I can tell you. There's been a lot of great things happening. But it doesn't stop at Navy to Navy issue. It's got to reach to immigration, transport, all sorts of data bank. And there's all sorts of people working at these things today. That's why we say the agreement would be important, just to set the tone and not only saying this is what we wish to do, but being directive as part of the agreement. From a technology point of view, it's not something with the mandate we had that we looked at and went into various cells saying, okay, where are we right now today? There's been great improvement. There's some of these systems in Canada and some ports. Does it cover everything? No. But the aim is to improve in the future from a technology point of view. And if there was the solution out there that would prevent anything from getting across from a radiological point of view, it already would be there. It's a question of, okay, where is the technology? What's the dimension of the problem we have? And priorities and ports, I know, have been put there because there's a lot of volume that can go through containers. But I don't have all the answers with regards to where we have, where we're at with technology among security agencies.
Oh, can I just add one thing on that point? You're right, of course. A radiological threat exists and is very low probability but high impact kind of event. And I think that's where, if I can just cobble on to Captain Bergeron's remarks, that's where things such as a CANUS threat assessment would come into play, because there's only going to be so much money, so much time, so much effort. And you have to go after the threats that are higher in the probability spectrum. And certainly anybody who wanted to mess up CANUS stuff would take a pleasure craft filled with fertilizer and blow it up under the Ambassador Bridge, and that'd be the end of it. It'd be a very significant event, and would not require all the kinds of contraptions that would be necessary to smuggle something across borders.
Yes, I think that your question illustrates the need to work together. I think the border events are a great example, and we talked about information sharing, the threat assessment, the civil assistance plan, for example. There's another recommendation in the final report we did not talk about for a legislative change in the U.S. to permit our weapons of mass destruction civil support teams, those consequence management teams, if you will, to cross the border into Canada. But those are exactly the kinds of events that we need to be prepared for, and that's why we need a comprehensive vision and agreement to work together for defense and security.
Just briefly, this also raises questions for Canada about its own intelligence capabilities that the Harper government has now opened, that whether or not there should be greater innate capability within CSIS or elsewhere for intelligence gathering overseas. It's all but non-existent now.
Hello, does it work? Yes. My name is Louis Bélanger. I'm a professor at Laval University in Quebec City. I'm currently invited professor at SAIS, and I was last fall right here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. First, I would like to congratulate our captains. I'm amazed at how bold and comprehensive is your report. I think if we compare what you have written to what has came out from the Security and Prosperity Partnership as an example, it's like if you have evolved in a completely different planet, and I think it's quite amazing. And to make a follow up to what Gigi has said, I think that yes, if you compare what you have come out and how audacious some of your concepts are to what we have been used to here for the past years, I think it's very refreshing. It's amazing. So I would like to congratulate you. My question would be, I would like you to maybe help me, and the other panelists, to help me isolate the impact of the Northern Command on the discussions on all these concepts. As you in your presentation made it very clear that before Northern Command, the relationship was quite special in the sense that other regions of the world were covered by military command in the U.S. It was not the case for Canada, so it opened the door to a special relationship. Now that we have this structure of command that covered also North America, it means that I'm certain that the bureaucratic, the technocratic structure or pressures will be very high to organize the relationships between U.S. and Canada the same way that it has been organized under other commands. So how do you think this will play in the 2 years discussion that we will have right now? Do you think it's a significant, structural factor, or do you think it is not?
Well, I don't know if you want to start with Northern Command. With regards to the combatant command concept, it's important to realize that the same combatant command we saw around the world is what has been put in place as far as policy in the U.S. And when you compare to Canada Command, I mentioned in the brief, we're not mirror image. I'll give you a few examples here that those are going to be reality checks in the future. Canada Command is structured on a geographic point of view with 6 regional commanders. In the U.S., it's not set up geographically. They're functional subcommand that reports to Northern Command. The commander himself reports to the Secretary of Defense in the United States. Canada Command reports to a military officer, and it's the Chief of Defense Staff. So just in the chain of command, it's quite different. And the structure of a combatant command, for example, having part of it a TSC, a Theater Security Cooperation, everywhere in the world, this is how it's structured. Countries that are within an area are part of this TSC. And when we look at the relationship already there between Canada and the U.S. under NORAD, there's undoubtedly going to be issues here that need to be resolved, and that's why the Chapter 7 is presented in the way it is, so options can be extracted from ideas that are found in each of 4, because we could end up in the end with a combination of elements of concepts. And there's definitely views that are seen from a national point of view because of the nature of the command. They're national commands. They're not binational command like NORAD. So as we aim at forging the future here, what's going to be very important is that the intent on both sides is understood, that we understand each other clearly about where we're at today, and there's different level of maturity and time here, and this becomes important from the standpoint U.S. Northern Command has been there for close to 4 years. In the case of Canada Command, they just stood up the 1st of February. So there's different level of maturity, and over the next couple of years, it will be important, and sooner rather than later, that the key stakeholders sit together and look at the concepts that are there, develop options, and in the end, for both the sake of both countries, we need to have a win-win situation compared to what we have currently with NORAD. When NORAD evolves, what will it be in 2 and 3, 5 years from now? From a Canadian standpoint, it's got to be something we can communicate and say we're better off today, we will better be off as a result of the new structure than we are today. And that's going to have to be an important aspect as whatever we negotiate between the commands in the two countries, that it's a win-win situation for both countries, given the reality of this change environment we're in with 4 new organizations and an evolving and maturing process nationally, because that is not even set in concrete nationally yet. The relationship between military and civilian agencies, it evolves. So I don't have a crystal ball to say exactly how it's going to end up, but I'm very optimistic that the end result of this will be a win-win situation for both countries.
And I agree with Richard that the combatant command structure needs to be somewhat different domestically when you are dealing with a country like Canada as opposed to another combatant command dealing with a country in its area of responsibility. Also agree, I don't know how those changes, which specific changes should be made to do that. I think that will evolve, as Richard just said, as the relationship between Canada and the U.S. evolves, the relationship among the commands and Department of Homeland Security and CEPSI.
Despite what I said about function in Canada-U.S. relations, we can't overlook the fact that symbolism plays a role, and we're stuck with the symbol of NORAD to some extent. You ask the average Canadian what NORAD is, and he won't respond probably it's a command or an agreement, but it's cooperation with the United States. So even in many of the platforms, the Parti Québécois said the sovereign Quebec would continue NORAD relations with the United States because NORAD is sort of the symbol of whatever it is that needs to be done with the United States. That's also true in NORAD headquarters historically too. I was talking before about a study done within NORAD headquarters. It's clear that people even within the headquarters thought of it as a command, an agreement, all the aerospace defense cooperation with the United States, or all defense cooperation with the United States. Now, that's going to get in the way. On the other hand, that has some important advantages because it means you can call anything NORAD. And as long as you stick a NORAD label on it, or say NORAD is continuing, and the problem is that the traditional missions no longer really require a combined command, a binational command. And the new ones don't really need them, or there's some political difficulties assigning them, including one set we haven't really talked about, the whole naval Coast Guard issues. Do you really want to run that out of Colorado Springs? People in Halifax and Norfolk are going to tell you something very, very different. So this all has to be sorted out. What does seem at least clear now is, you mentioned NORTHCOM, but you can't forget Canada-Com at the same time. What seems to be the case now, but we're all going to have to be thinking about this the next couple of years, those of us who are interested in it. About 6 people, I guess, outside the military. It seems to be the case that the relationship that has emerged between DHS and PSEPC, which was created to be a part an interlocutor with DHS, it may be parallel between the relationship between NORTHCOM and True NORTHCOM or Canada-Com, which some people think, only General Hillier knows for sure, was also in part created out of the inspiration of NORTHCOM. So there's an entirely new dynamic there that the report does catch here, by the way, powerfully in Chapter 7.
Back here.
Jeffrey Hale, University of Lethbridge, political scientist, currently in the Fulbright Chair at Duke University, Canadian Studies. The Bilateral Planning Group report talks about the possibility of bilateral coordination between defense and homeland security structures between Canada and the United States. Yet Professor Jockel has suggested that given the teething pains of new domestic security agencies on both sides of the border, such actions are more likely to take place in a national context before they take place in a binational context. Given the teething pains to which you're referring, that I think are fairly well known, and the difficulties which have emerged from the restructuring of intelligence systems in the United States, what are the lessons that you would draw from the challenges that have been faced by DHS, by the new commander or the new director of intelligence, and to a degree by PSEPC in Canada, and how would you apply those lessons to the challenge of defense security coordination, either nationally or binationally?
Please.
Well, that you touch upon the way you worded, sir, your question of the complexity of having different agencies talking to each other. I may say, if you look today realistically at all of this, if you go to Northern Command, there's over 40 interagencies that are present there. Everybody recognizes the need, I think nationally, and at Canada-Com, there's a lot of priority that is being put in having the proper coordination with security agencies in Canada, and all of this is maturing. The issue, I think, is one of, I don't think the intent of fostering those relationships is being acknowledged by everybody. The challenges in terms of the lessons learned, I think, has a lot to do from our experience at the Binational Planning Group and in positioning people, is nothing beats having people working side by side, especially in an era where systems are not yet compatible to allow the exchange of information. There's people behind all of these organizations, and if we don't allow the synergy from a human dimension to happen, I don't think we're optimizing the results of what we want to get. That's from a very pragmatic point of view. And I think at each command, whether it's U.S. Northern Command, Canada Command, there's already U.S. Northern Command personnel in Canada to make sure that the right information and the synergy between these two operation centers, we aim at optimizing it in the best way we can within the constraints that are there today by virtue of policy, by virtue of laws that prevent some of the information sharing. So my answer to you is very practical in the short term. When you apply it to a vision and an agreement, I think the lessons learned is we need something concrete that will define those type of issues, not only in providing authority to share, but direction to share. And Pam covered that somewhat as part of the brief, but in concrete terms, within the laws and policies that are there. We live in a democracy, and we have to, respect the laws, and privacy issues are huge. But it needs to be better defined from the top. But from a pragmatic point of view, a lot is being done, and people working side by side, there's no doubt that is key to all of this.
And one of the exceptions to the BPG not being part of the military command structure, we were allowed to be independent and not involved in day-to-day operations. During Katrina and the dealing with the effects of that event, BPG personnel were pulled into the day-to-day operations, particularly within U.S. Northern Command. And that allowed us to develop some lessons learned, especially in the context of civil support, again, military to military in support of a civil agency, and how to work among state and foreign affairs and DHS, PSEPSI, and the militaries. And we did develop some lessons learned with some recommendations on how to address those, and also how to make people aware of some of the existing agreements that are in place, that as you come to an event, for example, Department of Defense and Department of National Defense have a mutual cooperation agreement, how to use that agreement, how to use the NATO SOFA for people that are in the other's country. So we did develop that, and we also specifically looked at issues, cross-border issues, medical issues, medical personnel crossing the border. So that event did provide a forum for us to look at some of those issues and make some recommendations, which have been passed off to the national commands.
I was just going to say that I have no particular insight on the lessons of harmonizing intelligence and so on and so forth, but my observation would be that the struggles to achieve this will be much more intense on a national basis than they would be necessarily binationally. Binationally, we have been sharing intelligence and information for quite a while. There are a whole host, not just of CAN-U.S, but NATO, the ABCA agreements, and so on and so forth, for sharing the information. The problem is, as has been illustrated in the BPG, is that this information has been stovepiped. In other words, it's a military-to-military contact instead of military to someone on the other side who will be an information broker who will pass it on to the other interested agencies, because it is a much broader distribution that's required.
I'm afraid I don't know much about intelligence cooperation either. I can, however, endorse your notion, I agree with your notion about national teething pains being occurring first. We saw this first still underway, but it got further underway with Northcom. With Canada-Com, its complete role and set of role and responsibilities is still being worked out, and the teething pains are beginning to get quite evident in its relationship to the new Strategic Joint Staff. Isn't very clear. It wasn't as clear as everyone was expecting it to be. General Hillier has also created the equivalent of a joint staff, rough equivalent of the joint staff, not quite the same thing as the one here in the Pentagon. And the way that the relationship between Canada-Com and that staff was supposed to function isn't clear. Not everyone agrees. There's also a struggle with the environment about a relationship between Canada-Com and it. There's also a question to be worked out as to how NORAD roles and missions are, how the Canadian NORAD region is to relate to Canada-Com. All of that is being worked on now. I think you can expect that as the days and months and a year go by, Canada through Canada-Com is going to be in a much better position then to engage with the United States in some of these issues.
Anyone else?
Sir. Hi, sir. Philip O'Brien, U.S. Department of Defense. Just a comment in passing. In speaking of the two command structures and speaking of BPG, we're making a latent assumption that there's going to be a receipt of intelligence, which is proper. There's also an intelligence generation role that will come with a closer coordination. Part of it may be deliberate, a lot of it may be accidental. And in fact, the very act of closing a defense loop may create a greater human resource than previously. So you kind of end up looking at a couple of protocols, two of them obvious, two of them not too obvious. The obvious ones are sharing what comes in, but the less obvious ones are sharing what might be going out, initially through a national source, perhaps from a binational desk, and trying to work through the permutations of what is not only allowable, but practicable, and maybe even usable by a third party. We get into great circles where suddenly we're talking about the shortest line between 2 points not only affects the United States and Canada, but perhaps a recipient in Europe or in the Middle East or so forth. So the very volume of traffic will generate complications of its own, and good luck, because that'll be a mark of your success.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Captain Bergeron, to Captain McClune, Colonel Orr, and Dr. Jockel. Thanks so much for coming. We had a good discussion today, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you're interested.
Yeah, we saw an article, and a couple of articles actually that has.
It was very complimentary. It just says, oops.
And we'll be next week in Calgary. So.
In fact, I think Bergeron is in bed with the editorial.
I'm in Finland last summer. Erica could be on your list.
I got an editorial on the Calgary Herald saying,
Because I did such a convincing job with Louis.
Calgary had received this grant.
The interesting thing has been as we go around, people in general, I mean, the report is
And this is one of the issues that we would like
what he was before. I'm not sure. I know nothing about it. But it will be interesting how this.
Yeah.
Hi, nice to meet you. We've exchanged emails. Yes, indeed. My apologies for having to reschedule and get back to you. Are you heading back on the plane shortly, or do you have some time later today? Or?
No, I'm heading almost immediately.
Okay, that's fine.
But you're coming in.
June, unfortunately, will not work. The event that was supposed to bring us to Toronto has fallen apart due to health problems.
Oh, it's great idea.
Sure. Certainly. Okay. No, I appreciate your comments on gaining days because my question came out of this.